and part 10 of Sunnah of the Prophet. The specific circumstantial nature of the Sunnah of the Prophet, the core activity of Muhammad's Sunnah was to restrict the released and to release the restricted, to allow greater or lesser freedom in applying what Allah has permitted, al-halal. His legal decisions were also intended to regulate the affairs of his society and to modify its development within the parameters created by Allah's taboos, absolute taboos and permissions. Based on these premises, we can summarize the characteristics of Muhammad's Sunnah as follows. 1. His decisions were conditioned by the circumstances of life on the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. His ijtihads in restricting the allowed, al-halal, did not need divine revelations. 3. Muhammad's restrictions of the unrestricted permissions, halal, mutlaq, were subject to constant corrections due to changing circumstances in his life. His ijtihads were not infallible and can therefore, unlike revelations, be corrected. His ijtihads, number 5, his ijtihads, prophetic or not, do not constitute Islamic legislation. Instead, they reflect his applications of civil law arising from the historical conditions of 7th century Arabia. In administrating the state and society of his time, Muhammad applied a specific civil law, Qanun Madani, suitable for his time, which by reason of its historical contingency has no transhistorical validity, even if the reports about it, the hadiths, are totally accurate. The best example we can give to illustrate the specificity of Muhammad's ijtihad is his interdiction against visiting graves. We notice that Muhammad first restricted the release and then, after much deliberation, reversed his decision and released the restricted. Whether one is allowed to visit graves or not was not explicitly decided by divine injunction in the book. It therefore fell into the category of absolutely allowed, al-halal. Muhammad was free to allow such practices, but in order to combat superstitious practices of Jahiliyyah Arabia, Muhammad exercised legitimate restrictions of the released and forbade the practice. This did not reflect divine legislation, nor did it forbid such visits for all time. In fact, after the idea and moral principles of the new faith had been implanted in the hearts of most Arabs, Muhammad reversed his decision and allowed women to visit the graves again. This reversal has confused generations of Muslim jurists since. In their understanding, Muhammad had first created an absolute taboo and then abandoned it. And everything that Muhammad did carried, in the eyes of the scholars, legislative significance, a misconception that fatefully became the whole rationale of Islamic fiqh. It led to great confusion in deciding whether visiting graves was allowed in Islam or not. We know that the jurist's solution to the dilemma was to invent a doctrine of abrogation, and God knows where they got that from. Instead of acknowledging that Muhammad simply decided what was best for society at a specific time of his life, they tried to prove the existence of abrogated and abrogating hadiths, nasikh wa mansukh, from which then they deduced the existence of abrogated and abrogating verses in the book. Instead of wasting our time in exploring what is abandoned and what is abrogated and what is not, it is more important for us today to commission our parliaments and ask them to release the restricted and to restrict the released in what Allah has permitted, and do this strictly in accordance with the conditions of contemporary society. In doing so, we would follow the Sunnah of the Prophet and emulate his example in the best possible and most authentic way. The content of prophetic hadith. The prophetic saying of Muhammad can be divided into two categories: words of wisdom and prophetic statements. A. Words of wisdom. A reference to such words of wisdom can be found in the following verses of the book. God has sent down the scripture and wisdom to you and taught you what you did not know. Surah An-Nisa 4 verse 113. He gives wisdom to whoever he will. Whoever is given wisdom has truly been much good, but only those with insight bear in mind. Al-Baqarah 2 verse 269. And recite what is rehearsed to you in your homes of the science of God and his wisdom, for God understands the finest mysteries and is well acquainted with them. Al-Ahzab 33 verse 34. We bestow in the past wisdom on Luqman. Show your gratitude to God. Surah Luqman 31 verse 12. A person who speaks words of wisdom does not need the help of divine revelation, not even of prophethood or messengerhood. Luqman was not a prophet, and yet we hear in verse 12 of Surah 31, we bestowed in the past wisdom on Luqman. In the book we find many such precepts of wisdom, which incidentally proves that Muhammad Idris al-Shafi'i view that wisdom is primarily represented by the Sunnah of the Prophet is totally wrong. Do not follow blindly what you do not know to be true. Ears, eyes, and heart, you will be questions about all these. Do not strut arrogantly about the earth. You cannot break it open nor match the mountains in height. The evil of all these actions is hateful to your Lord. O Prophet, this is some of the wisdom your Lord has revealed to you. Surah Al-Isra 17 verse 36 to 39. The essential features of wisdom, of words of wisdom, is that they contain moral sayings that are universally understood and shared by all people. Let us quote some examples from a variety of hadiths. There should be no harm to anyone, and there should be no harm in retaliation if someone was harmed before. Leave behind what gives you doubt for what does not give you doubt. Begin with yourself and then with your brother. The one who believes in God and the last day, he shall speak nicely or not speak at all. No one is truly a believer unless he desires for his brother what he desires for himself. A Muslim is one from whose hand and tongue people are safe. Wisdom is the believer's lost property. Wherever he finds it, he takes it. Another feature is that words of wisdom are formulated from the pool of human experiences and hence come from within human beings. They may be perceived by revelation, but revelation is not necessarily in order to speak words of wisdom. We also commonly say, take wisdom from the mouths of the crazy people. So the following hadiths make it clear that wisdom is of distinct quality to revelation. Wisdom is harmful to the believer when he finds it and it is taken away again. No religious or civil law should be based on words of wisdom. One of the above mentioned hadith states that the one who believes in God and the last day, he shall speak nicely or not speak at all. Such prophetic statements cannot be turned into a doctrine or religious law, because if they were, every believer who is very talkative and sometimes prattle unto nonsense must be imprisoned or called a kafir. That is, someone who because of his talkative nature is a renegade and disbeliever in Allah and the last day. God forbids that words of wisdom are turned into law or doctrine. What this hadith wants to teach us is that a good believer is moderate in his speech, chooses his words carefully, and tries to be as exact and precise as possible when he describes things or talk about other people. And B, statements of the prophets. This will continue in the next part. Thank you for following part 10, and we would like to hear your thoughts. Part 11 from the Sunnah of the Prophet will follow. Thank you.